She heard the axe stop. That was what did it. Not the pain in her leg, not the cold, not the 3 days of moving through timber she didn't know. The silence where the chopping had been. She'd been using the sound to navigate around him, keeping it at a distance, and then it stopped and she miscalculated and her leg went out from under her at the tree lean and she was down in the mud before she could decide anything about it. She didn't make a sound. That was the first thing she'd learned, and she'd learned it early enough that it was past habit now, past instinct, closer to the way her lungs remembered to breathe. You didn't make sounds when you went down. You waited. You assessed, actually. You found out what was coming before it arrived. What came was boots, plus big ones, moving through the brush without hurrying, and she had just enough time to get her back against the nearest pine before he came around the deadfall and stopped. He was large. That was the first thing, not tall so much as wide through the shoulders, the kind of wide that came from years of actual work rather than wanting to seem like it. Brown coat, worn through at the elbows, a beard that had opinions about itself. He was carrying the axe loosely at his side, and he was looking at her leg, not her face, which was she didn't know what that was. He said something in English. She caught hurt and help, and she kept her eyes on him and didn't answer. He set the look, axe down, slowly, handle first into the mud, blade up, several feet away from him. Then he crouched down her height and looked at her leg again and said something else, and this time she caught Carrie, and she said in English that came out flatter than she intended, "I'll walk." He looked at her. She looked back. "All right," he said. Basically, she tried. She got 3 steps before the leg betrayed her again, and this time he was already there, one arm under hers, taking the weight without being asked. She thought about fighting it. Her body simply didn't have the votes. He didn't speak on the walk to the cabin. She noted that. He also didn't hold her any tighter than the terrain required, and when they reached the step he paused and let her manage it at her own pace and didn't reach for her again until she was tipping. Inside was one room, a fire banked low, a table, a cot against the far wall, and a bedroll on the floor beside it. He set her on the cot, and she was upright and braced before he'd even straightened, her eyes already cataloging door, one window, no lock on either, axe outside, and too far, nothing in reaching distance except a tin cup. He noticed. She could tell he noticed. His face didn't change much, but something behind it did, and he took a step back, and then another, and then he was at the door. "I'll get wood," he said, and he went outside. She sat in the silence of the cabin and listened to him move around out there, unhurried, no voices, no sounds of anyone else arriving. Just the sort of thump of wood being stacked, and the mule making a noise of protest about something, and him saying something short back to it. She looked at her leg. The wrappings she'd made were soaked through, and she needed to change them, and she was going to need something to do that with, and she was going to have to either ask or find, and she had not decided which when the door opened. He set a bowl on the floor just inside, the threshold, steam coming off it. Something simple, something she could smell, had no smell she feared. He set a cloth beside it, folded, and a small clay jug that sloshed when he put it down. He didn't come inside. He pretty much set the things down, straightened, and walked away. She heard his boots on the step. Then silence. She looked at the bowl for a long time. It was the boots that she kept coming back to. His left lace was undone, had been undone since she'd first seen him, trailing in the mud. He had carried her across uneven ground and cut wood and carried water, and the lace had dragged through all of it, and he had not one stop to tie it. The bowl steamed. She ate. Plus, she didn't know why it sat in her chest the way it did. After, not warm, not reassurance, something more complicated. A feeling like losing an argument she hadn't known she was making. She'd eaten, I guess, because she needed to, and because the food wasn't a trap she could identify, and both of those things were true, and neither of them was the whole truth. The fire was, I guess, warmer than it had been. He must have built it up while she was eating. She kept her back to the wall and slept in her own clothes with the tin cup where she could reach it, and she woke 4 times to silence. And in the morning he was already outside, and the bowl from last night was gone, and there was a fresh one just inside the door. She stared at the ceiling for a while. Outside, the axe started up again. 3 days, and he still hadn't asked for anything. She'd been counting. Not the days exactly. She'd lost some precision there. The fever had done that. But the interactions. Basically the bowls of food. The times he'd come in to tend the fire. The morning, he'd looked at her leg with the expression of a man solving a fence problem and then done the work of cleaning and rewrapping the wound with a focus so clinical it had felt almost like privacy. He'd said this will hurt before each thing that hurt. He was, correct each time. He hadn't asked her name. He hadn't asked where she'd come from or what she'd been doing in his timber or who was looking for her. He talked to his mule more than he talked to her, and she'd had enough time to listen to those conversations to understand that the mule's name was Porter, and Porter had ongoing grievances about the quality of his feed that Callum considered largely performative. She was learning his name from the habit of listening. He talked to himself sometimes when he thought she was asleep. Not much, just the edge of it. There, Callum. That's the one. That's done. On the fourth morning, she tried to leave. Her legs said no. Not with pain exactly. The pain she could work with, but with a structural refusal, a simply not yet that she couldn't override through willingness alone. She got to the door, and she got through it. She made it 20 feet into the pale morning light before the leg reminded her of the exact limits of the situation. He was at the woodpile. He saw her. He didn't move toward her or call out or make any face she could read as alarm. He picked up his axe and split the log he'd been about to split before she appeared. And then he looked up. "Farther than yesterday," he said. She stood in the mud and looked at him. "Your crutch will be done tonight," he said, "if you want it." She went back inside. She sat on the cot, and she looked at the wood shavings on the floor near the table. Pale curls of pine he'd been working at for 2 evenings, something taking shape out of a branch she'd seen him strip and smooth. She hadn't asked what it was. She told herself she didn't need to know. She refused the food at midday, set kind of the bowl back at the door without touching it. He came by an hour later and left a different bowl, dried meat this time, something she recognized, and a cup of water, and went away again. No change in his face that she could see through the window. No adjustment in the way he moved. If she'd made a point, it had landed nowhere she could measure. That bothered her more than it should have. By evening, she was eating the meat and watching him through the window as he worked at the branch again. He worked slowly, and she noticed that about him. Not laziness, something more deliberate, like a man who'd done enough things fast that he'd lost his enthusiasm for the approach. The mule porter stood nearby, ostensibly watching, though mostly he appeared to be expressing philosophical skepticism about the whole enterprise. She almost smiled. She stopped herself before she finished. She needed to stop watching him like she was building a map of him. That was what she'd done with the others. The knowing was just another form of calculation, and she was past needing to calculate everything. She was supposed to be past that. He was at the door. He didn't come in. He set the crutch on the floor inside the threshold the way he left everything, quietly, without asking to be witnessed, and straightened. It was rough but considered, the height calculated correctly somehow, the grip wrapped with a piece of leather that wouldn't slip. "Good night," he said, and went to his bedroll by the fire. She looked at the crutch. She looked at the wood shavings on the floor. They were the same wood. He'd been carving this since the day he'd brought her in, maybe from the start, maybe before she'd been able to see him clearly enough to notice his hands moving. In the morning, she stood up. The crutch fit exactly. Not close to exactly. Exactly, in a way that meant someone had watched her, had measured without a measure, had paid attention to the specific length of her, and made something accordingly. She stood in the cabin on one leg and one cut branch. The fit was exact, and she stared at the fire because she needed to look at something that wasn't that. She laughed before she could stop herself. He'd been arguing with a pine stump for the better part of 10 minutes. Axe boot, a stick he'd picked up, then back to the axe, and the stump was winning in the philosophical sense, firmly rooted in its position, indifferent to the labor being applied to it. He said something at it in a low voice. The stump didn't respond. He took his hat off, looked at the sky, put his hat back on. She was at the edge of the cabin with her crutch, getting her first real sun in a week, and the laugh came out of her before she decided to let it. I think he looked over. She pressed her mouth flat. Too late. Plus, it's the roots, he said, without any defensiveness. They go sideways on this kind. Can't just come at it straight. I know, she said. He looked at her for a beat. How do you get them out? She told him. He listened with the same focus he gave everything, attentive, no rush, and tried it her way, and the stump came up in 3 more strikes, and he stood looking at the hole it left with the expression of a man who had been vindicated and was trying not to be obvious about it. She moved around the camp more that day than she had since arriving. The kind of leg was knitting slowly, but the crutch made the range possible, and she found herself noting things the way he'd stored the split wood practical but exposed on one side to weather a problem another month. The fire pit, functional but inefficient, the way the trees broke here to let an afternoon light she could have used better than he was using it. She fixed the fire pit in the late afternoon, rearranging the stones into a tighter circle that would hold heat and direct the smoke. She didn't ask. He came back from the far timber and looked at it and didn't say anything for a moment. Better, she said. To be fair, yeah, he said. Quite a bit. He started to fire her way. It caught faster. He crouched there and watched it like he was taking notes. That evening, she couldn't stop the story from coming out. She wasn't sure how it started. He'd asked something about where she was from, the flat, careful version of the question, not prying so much as creating. Space if she wanted it. And she'd answered something minimal, and then somehow she was talking about the camp, and then the soldiers, and then she stopped. My sister, she said. I don't know. She looked at the fire. We were separated. I've been trying to... I don't know where she's. He was quiet for a long moment. What's her name? The question landed clean. Just that. Not how old, not what happened, not any of the forward-leaning things people asked when they wanted story rather than the person. Pretty much Chayton, she said. She goes by Chayton. She doesn't like her other name. He said it back. Chayton. The way he said it, low and careful, like he was making sure he had the shape of it right. She looked at the fire, and it was burning better than his ever had. The new configuration holding the heat the way she'd intended. She looked at the clean orange of it, and the way it didn't waste itself in smoke, and she thought about Chayton, who always took too much wood and never enough time, and the fire she'd built for her 100 mornings in a bad camp, a worse camp, the last camp. She builds a bad fire, Winona said, to no one in particular. She always has. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. The night settled around them, and the fire she'd made burned steady. She, slept that night without her back against the wall. She noticed that in the morning, the absence of the old position, the way her body had made a different calculation in the night without asking her. She lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling and felt the fact of it, that small rearrangement. Outside, the mule porter was having fresh complaints about breakfast. Callum's voice answered him, patient, unconvinced. She got up and went to the door and stood in the light. The land agent's horse came out of the tree line at noon. She knew what he was before he reached the camp. The cut of the coat, the way he rode with the particular ease of a man who'd never been told no by terrain because terrain didn't have the paperwork to stop him. His horse was better than anything the land warranted. That was always sort of the sign. She was, at the side of the cabin when he came into the clearing, and she went inside without hurrying because hurrying would have looked like what it was. Through the window, she watched him take in the camp with an inventory gaze. Woodpile, cabin, smoke, mule. And then he saw Callum coming in from the south tree line, and his attention gathered. Briggs, the man said, which Callum had his axe from the morning still in his hand. He didn't set like it down. Drace. Drace dismounted with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to check whether it was safe to. He walked a few steps toward the cabin and stopped, and his eyes moved to the window where she'd stepped back from the light, and she had the specific cold thought that she hadn't stepped back far enough. Heard you had a visitor, Drace said. He was still watching the window, checking basically whether there's anything to the territory claims out this way. Strays wandering through timber that's been assigned tends to complicate the assessments. That right, Callum said. His voice was the same as when he talked to the stump. If you've seen anyone Sioux, maybe some of the ones from the Cantrell clearing, that's technically a matter for the agency. Drace's eyes came back to Callum. You'd want to mention it. The window. She was calculating the window. Through it she could see Callum's right hand on the axe, not raised, not moving, just present, the way his thumb rested in the worn groove of the handle. She'd looked at that spot before, the dark wood where years of grip had changed the grain. She basically looked at it now, because looking at his face might make her make a sound, and she had learned young not to make sounds. Drace was talking about legality, about territory lines, about the courtesy of cooperation with the agencies, work, which was ongoing, which was for everyone's benefit when you looked at the larger picture. Callum waited. There was something about watching him wait that she had not had words for until now. Not patience exactly, not the strategic stillness of a man calculating odds. Simpler than that. The same pretty much quality the timber had, the good pine, deep-rooted, indifferent to the size of the thing trying to move it. Drace moved toward the cabin door. Callum stepped in front of it. No change in his voice, and no change in his face. He looked at Drace the way he'd looked at the stuck pine stump. Not with rage, not with performance. Just, the clean acknowledgement of a problem that needed to be solved by continuing to stand exactly where he was standing. She's my wife, he said. 2 words, and then silence. No hesitation, which no flicker of calculation before them. No self-consciousness after. He said it the way he said good night, where your crutch will be done tonight. Like a fact he was reporting, not a play he was making. Drace was still. Something in his face rearranged into a different shape, and the new shape wasn't what she'd braced for. Not anger. Something more inconvenienced, which you married a Sioux woman, Drace said. I did. A silence. The horse shifted weight. Porter made a sound of distant editorial commentary from behind the woodpile. Drace looked at the cabin once more, and then at Callum, and something passed across his face that she recognized, the specific calculation of a man deciding whether something was worth the cost, and the answer had arrived that was no. He mounted. He rode out the way he'd come, and the tree line swallowed him, and then there was just the clearing and the smoke and the sound of wind coming down through the pines. Like Callum came inside. He set the axe down in the corner the way he always did, handle up, and he went to the fire and checked it and added a log and didn't look at her. She didn't ask, and he didn't explain. She looked at the axe handle in the corner, the grain of it, the worn groove where his thumb had been, and she made herself look away. Something had happened in the room without either of them naming it, the way weather happened. You looked up, and it was different, and you couldn't put the moment of change exactly, only the fact of the difference. She had stopped thinking of this as his cabin at some point in the last few minutes, or perhaps the last few days, and she had not noticed the shift until it was already complete, like the fire rearranging into better heat before you saw that you were warmer. He said, after a while, "You hungry?" "Yes," she said. He made dinner. She sat by, looked the fire. Outside, the pines stood in their own company, deep-rooted, unmoved. Her leg was healed enough to travel. She knew it the morning she woke, and stood without reaching for the crutch, and didn't need to think about it, the weight distributing itself evenly without argument. She stood in the center of the cabin in the gray early light, and took a step, and then another, and the leg held, and there was a thing to feel about that except what she felt, which was complicated. She told TBH, him over breakfast, which he nodded. He asked if she wanted to take food for the road, and she said yes, and he didn't ask where the road went, and she found she needed to say it anyway. "I'm good, I guess. Find Chayton," she said. "I know where the band was trying to get to. I might be wrong about where she ended up, but I need to look." "Yeah," he said. "Of course." She packed. He helped without being asked. Moving alongside her in the small space of the cabin with the same economy, he brought to everything, useful and quiet, finding the things she needed before she reached for them. He gave her wrapped meat, a bladder of water, a wool blanket she recognized as one of his better ones. She started to say something about the blanket, and he was already packing something else. She went to the door. She stood there for a moment, looking at the room, the fire, the cot, the wood shavings she hadn't swept up, and neither had he, the crutch leaning against the wall that she didn't need anymore. She looked at all of it with the part of her brain that filed things away against future reference, and what it filed was more than she'd intended. She walked out. The morning was clear, the light coming sideways through the pines, cold and honest. She got to the tree lean. She stopped. I think, not the leg. She checked, and it was the leg, and then it wasn't, and she knew what it was, and she stood at the edge of the timber and felt the knowing settle through her like a cold drink, something that clarified rather than fogged. She thought about Chayton, who was somewhere north or west or somewhere, who built bad fires and took too much wood and laughed at things that weren't funny and was the only person left in the world who knew Winona's other name. She was going to find her. That wasn't the thing she was standing here deciding. She turned around. The cabin was still there. So was he, at the door, not following, not calling out, just standing the way he stood, like a thing that had decided where it was and wasn't in any urgency about the rest. He had his hat in his hands. She didn't know when he'd taken it off. She walked back. She stopped in front of him and looked at his face, which was doing the thing it did. Not showing what it knew, just holding it. And she said, I'm going to come back. He looked at her for a moment. Just that. I'll be here, he said. 2 words. She turned them over once, and then she let them be what they were, which was enough. Which was more than she'd been given in a long time. Not the words themselves, not even the promise in them, but the clean lack of conditions attached. Know if you know as long as just here. As a simple fact, like deep-rooted timber, like a fire that burned because someone had taken the time to build it right. She looked past him into the cabin, at the crutch against the wall that she didn't need anymore, at the wood shavings still on the floor, at the fire he'd built her way since the 3rd day without being asked again. She thought about what she'd tell Chayton. Plus, there's a man. He fixed a stump on my advice and never mentioned it again. He said she was my wife to a man with government papers and didn't explain himself after. He has a mule named Porter who has complaints. She thought about Chayton's face hearing that, the exact expression, the way she'd want all of it repeated slowly. She was going to find her. She was going to bring her back here, or she was going to come back alone, or some third thing that she couldn't see yet, but she was going to come back. That wasn't a calculation. That wasn't a thing she was doing because she had no options, or because she owed a debt, or because some fear she hadn't named had arranged itself around a person in the way fear sometimes did. She chose it, standing in a morning light with a healed leg and a packed blanket and a name she was going to walk toward. She chose it, eyes open, her own legs under her. Don't let Porter run the camp while I'm gone, she said. Something moved in his face. He runs it anyway, he said. I've accepted this. She turned and walked into the trees. The pines were tall and clear-smelling, and the light came through them sideways in long, pale lines. And her leg held every step, and she didn't look back because she didn't need to. The cabin was there. To be fair, plus he was there. She walked toward her sister's name with something in her chest that wasn't quite peace and not quite joy, and was somewhere between them in a place that felt, after a long time away from it, like something she'd been before the burning, before the fear, before she'd learned to sleep with her back against the wall. She thought, Chayton is going to want to meet the mule. And she almost smiled, and then she did